A Navy SEAL was crossing a frozen forest road in Montana when his headlights hit something that should have already been dead. A Malinois puppy stood alone in the blizzard, covered in snow, shaking so hard it could barely stay on its feet. But it didn't bark, didn't run, didn't cry. It just stared at him. The moment he lifted it, he found old scars beneath the fur and a collar that had been cut clean through. Then he looked up and saw a dark SUV slipping between the trees. Someone hadn't lost this puppy. Someone had left it there to disappear. But what that SEAL carried home that night was more dangerous than he could have imagined, because hidden inside that freezing little body was the first clue to a secret buried deep in the mountain. Before we begin, tell me what time you're watching right now, and if you love intense stories of courage, loyalty, and mystery, like, share, and subscribe to K9 and SEAL Stories. Late winter in northern Montana had a way of making the world look both beautiful and unforgiving at the same time. That afternoon, the forest seemed carved from steel and glass. Pale silver light filtered through the tall pines, touching the bark in long, cold streaks and turning the snow along the logging road into a sheet of dull white fire. Wind moved high through the trees in restless waves, shaking loose powder from the branches and sending it drifting across the narrow road in ghostly ribbons. It was not yet dark, but the storm clouds had lowered enough to flatten the sky into a hard gray lid, and the deeper Stellan cross drove into the forest, the more the world felt sealed away from everything human. His old pickup moved carefully over the rutted track, tires crunching through packed snow and slipping now and then on hidden ice. The heater worked only well enough to keep the windshield clear, and the cab smelled faintly of cold leather, machine oil, and wood smoke from the jacket he had thrown onto the seat earlier that morning. Stellan was 35 years old, broad-shouldered, disciplined, and built like a man who had spent most of his adult life treating his own body as a tool that had to obey. His face was angular and weathered in a way that had little to do with age and more to do with years spent outdoors under strain in places where alertness kept a person alive. He wore his dark blonde hair short and neat, and his clean-shaven jaw gave his expression a sharper severity than he usually intended. His eyes were blue-gray and habitually watchful, the eyes of someone who had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself with the courtesy people expected in stories. Even here, alone on a mountain road after helping a family near the ridge get their generator running again, he drove as if part of him were still on some invisible perimeter. Retirement had changed his schedule, not his instincts. He had left the Navy years earlier, but the habits remained buried in muscle and breath. Pause before a blind turn. Check the tree line. Listen for what does not belong. Measure silence. Trust it only when it makes sense. The family he had just helped lived in a weather-beaten cabin near the edge of the mountain. The kind of place that only looked romantic to people who had never had to survive a real winter. The husband had shaken Stellan's hand with embarrassed gratitude when the generator coughed back to life. The wife had offered coffee. Stellan had declined gently, the way he usually declined all invitations to linger. He was known around the area as dependable and courteous, but he kept his distance. People sometimes mistook that for coldness. It was not coldness. It was weariness worn smooth by years. Solitude had become easier than explaining why crowds, noise, and too many questions felt like sand in an old wound. The road curved sharply between two dense walls of pine. Snow blew sideways across the headlights. Stellan slowed automatically. The truck's beams swept across the bend, caught a shape ahead, and for one brief second, his mind refused to name what he was seeing. It was too small, too still, too strange against the storm. He braked hard, the pickup jolting once before settling into a low, growling idle. In the middle of the road, half buried by drifting snow, stood a puppy. At first glance, it looked almost carved from the storm itself. Snow clung to its back and head so thickly that its natural color had been muted into white and ash. But beneath the frost he could see the outline of a Belgian Malinois. A narrow face, upright ears not fully steady yet, a compact body too young and too thin for the cold it had been left to endure. Ice hung in clear, fragile strands from the fur beneath its muzzle and belly. Its legs trembled so violently, the movement was almost invisible, a tiny shudder buried inside stiffness. And yet it did not bark. It did not run. It did not even turn away from the lights. It only stood there with its paws nearly swallowed by snow, looking straight at the truck, as if it had already accepted that either salvation or death would come from whatever stopped in front of it. The sight hit Stellan harder than he expected, not because he had never seen suffering. He had seen too much of it, in too many forms. But suffering usually made noise. Panic made noise. Fear tried to escape. This little thing was nearly frozen solid, and still it was silent. That silence unsettled him more than if the puppy had cried out. He cut the engine, opened the door, and stepped into the wind. The cold struck him immediately, sharp and invasive, filling his lungs like shattered glass. He closed the truck door quietly out of reflex and stood still for half a second, reading the scene the way training had taught him to read everything. No other vehicles in sight. No human footprints visible through the fresh drift. Tree line thick on both sides. Wind from the northwest. Puppy centered in the road, not wandering, not collapsed. Stellan moved closer, boots sinking into the snow with a dry crunch. The puppy watched him the entire time. Up close it looked worse. It was small for its age, maybe 3 or 4 months at most, with the lean-boned structure of a Malinois, but not the healthy awkwardness of a normal young dog. Its coat under the frost was deep fawn with dark shading along the back, and a distinct black mask sharpened its narrow face. The eyes were dark amber, far too focused, far too steady. There was pain in them and exhaustion, but not confusion. That was what stopped Stellan half a step away. This was not the vacant terror of an abandoned animal that no longer understood what was happening. This was controlled stillness, measured, almost trained. "Easy," he said, his voice low, calm. The same tone he had once used to steady men younger than himself in places much worse than this road. The puppy's ears twitched faintly. No bark, no whine. Stellan crouched, ignoring the bite in his knees, and extended a gloved hand, slowly. The puppy sniffed once, barely moving, then held still again. Stellan saw the tremor in its jaw, and the way the cold had begun to lock the muscles around its shoulders. He slipped one hand beneath its chest, and the other behind its hind legs. The body he lifted was shockingly light and frighteningly rigid, as if warmth had already begun leaving from the inside out. The puppy did not struggle. It pressed no closer to him, but it did not resist. As Stellan turned back toward the truck, the dog's head shifted weakly against his sleeve, and that was when he saw the marks. Along the left shoulder, where the ice had matted the fur flat, were several faint scars. Small, round, and old enough not to be fresh injuries, but not old enough to belong to age. Evenly spaced, deliberate-looking. A cut piece of collar still circled the puppy's neck, the leather sliced cleanly through rather than broken by wear. Stellan felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the weather. He wrapped the puppy inside his heavy jacket, tucking fabric around the little body, to trap what heat he could, and rose to his feet. Then he saw movement. Far down the road, barely visible through the storm, a dark SUV slipped between the trees where the logging road bent west and vanished. It might have been nothing more than coincidence. Someone headed home before the weather worsened. Someone who had never seen the animal in the road. Someone innocent. But Stellan had spent too many years depending on the difference between what was possible and what was likely. The timing was wrong, the distance was wrong, and the clean cut on the collar was wrong. He stood there a moment longer, the puppy tucked against his chest, the wind needling his face while the snow erased every trace the vehicle might have left. A hard old instinct rose in him, one he disliked because it was so rarely wrong. This was not an accident. He got the puppy into the truck, laid it carefully across the passenger seat with his jacket wrapped tight around it, and turned the heater up as high as the dyeing system would allow. Meltwater began dripping almost immediately from the little body, darkening the seat fabric. For a few moments, Stellan just sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, watching the puppy's sides for movement. The breathing was there. Shallow, uneven, but there. The dog's eyes stayed half open, fixed somewhere between him and the storm outside, as if sleep itself were a thing it had not yet decided could be trusted. "You're still here," Stellan murmured, though he was not sure whether he meant the words for the puppy or for himself. He started the truck and pulled back onto the road. The forest thickened around them, pines leaning inward under the weight of snow, as if guarding secrets no one had asked them to keep. The storm intensified in silence, flakes striking the windshield with soft, relentless force. Inside the cab, the only sounds were the engine, the wipers, and the faint, ragged breathing from the seat beside him. Stellan kept glancing over every few seconds, not out of sentimentality, but because vigilance was the shape care took in men like him. He had lived alone long enough in his cabin near the forest edge that each drive home usually felt the same, predictable, stripped down, contained. But this one did not. Something in the truck had changed, not only because there was another heartbeat inside it, small and fragile and refusing to quit, but because the old quiet inside his own chest had shifted too. He did not like how quickly that happened. He did not trust it. Yet he could not deny it. The puppy should have been making noise by now. Most would have. Shivering cries, restless movement, a scramble to survive. This one remained almost unnaturally still, conserving what little strength it had with a discipline that felt learned. Twice, as the truck hit rough patches, the puppy's eyes flicked toward the side window, then to the windshield, then back to Stellan's hands on the wheel, tracking, assessing. Even nearly frozen, it was reading the world. The realization stayed with him all the way to the cabin. By the time he turned onto the narrow track that led to his place, dusk had begun to settle into the trees. His cabin sat alone near the edge of a frozen clearing, built of dark timber and fieldstone, with a porch half buried in old snow and smoke stains above the chimney from years of winter fires. It had once looked to other people like peace. To Stellan, most days it simply looked like enough. He parked as close to the steps as he could, killed the engine, and reached immediately for the puppy. This time the dog made the smallest sound when he lifted it. Not a whine, not even a yelp, just a thin breath released through clenched exhaustion. It was the first proof that somewhere beneath the strange stillness, pain had not frozen everything human beings would have called spirit. Stellan carried it inside. Warmth met them in layers, old wood, banked coals, the faint lingering scent of pine smoke. He shut the door on the storm and stood still in the dim cabin light, the puppy bundled in his arms while snow hissed softly against the windows. For one suspended moment, the world outside felt impossibly far away. Then the wind hit the cabin wall again, and he remembered the SUV disappearing through the trees, the cut collar, the scars under the frost. He set the puppy down gently on a folded wool blanket near the fire and knelt beside it. The dog looked up at him with those same dark amber eyes, not trusting, not afraid, simply awake in a way that did not belong to something so young. Outside, the blizzard moved through the forest and erased the road, the tracks, the bend in the pines, and whatever truth had left that small creature standing alone in the snow. Inside, for the first time in a long while, Stellan Cross felt the shape of a question enter his life and refused to leave. By the time the fire had settled into a steady burn, the storm outside had deepened into a white silence that seemed to press against every wall of Stellan Cross's cabin. Snow moved past the windows in soft diagonal sheets, blurring the dark trunks of the pines beyond the clearing, until the whole forest looked half erased. Inside, warmth gathered slowly rather than generously. The cabin was not large, and nothing in it had been arranged for comfort first. It had been built and used by a man who preferred function, order, and enough rather than ease. A cast-iron stove glowed in one corner, its metal ticking softly as heat spread through the room. A heavy workbench stood near the back wall beneath shelves of tools, bolts, wire, oil cans, and repair manuals. A narrow table sat beside the window, and against the far wall was a worn couch whose blankets had been folded with military precision. Stellan moved through that space with the efficient economy of someone who had long ago made solitude into routine. He did not rush because panic wasted motion, but there was no hesitation in him now either. He knelt beside the wool blanket near the stove and carefully unwrapped the puppy from his jacket. The little Belgian Malinois lay there stiff with exhaustion, half-melted snow darkening the blanket beneath him. Up close in the cabin light, he looked even younger than Stellan had first thought, and somehow smaller. The puppy's coat, once the frost softened, showed a rich, deep fawn along the sides and a darker line along the spine, with a distinct black mask over the face that made the eyes seem even more intense. Those eyes were open again now, dark amber and unnervingly focused. Most puppies in that condition would have cried, crawled blindly toward heat, or panicked at unfamiliar hands. This one did none of those things. He watched. That was what unsettled Stellan. The puppy followed every movement he made. The reaching for a towel, the pouring of warm water into a bowl, the shifting of a log into the stove. Not with fear, but with an alertness that felt measured. It was not trust. It was assessment. Stellan crouched lower and used a dry cloth to blot the moisture from the dog's fur, taking care not to rub too hard over the small body. The puppy trembled, but did not pull away. When Stellan lifted one paw to check for cuts from ice, the puppy allowed it, though his eyes never left Stellan's face. "You're either the calmest pup I've ever seen," Stellan murmured, "or somebody taught you the wrong lessons too early." His own voice sounded strange in the cabin. He was not used to speaking aloud unless there was reason. The words were partly for the dog, partly for the room, and partly to fill a silence that had begun to feel different from the one he usually lived in. He set down the paw, brought the bowl closer, and waited. After a few seconds, the puppy leaned forward and lapped at the warm water, in controlled little motions, pausing between each to look up as though checking permission. That struck Stellan harder than he expected. Even in hunger, even in cold, the animal behaved as if impulse had already been punished out of him. He sat back on his heels and watched the tiny ribs move beneath damp fur. The old scars along the shoulder were more visible now. Not claw marks, not random scratches from brush, small, circular points evenly placed. He had seen patterns like that before, though not on something this young. A memory stirred at the edge of his mind and refused to become clear, the way difficult things often did when they came from a life he no longer liked thinking about. He pushed the thought away and stood, crossing to a cabinet for canned broth. He thinned it with water, warmed it carefully, then returned and offered it a spoonful at a time. Again the puppy drank with eerie restraint. Not once did he whine, not once did he lunge. As the hours passed, the storm went from hard weather to a closed world. Darkness thickened outside the windows before evening properly arrived, and the pines beyond the clearing faded into black vertical shadows. Stellan lit a lamp on the table and added more wood to the fire. The puppy, after drinking and finally taking a few bites of softened food, shifted for the first time on his own. He did not crawl toward the stove. He did not seek the hottest corner of the room. Instead, with visible effort, he moved across the blanket and settled where he could see both the front door and most of the cabin interior. He was still close enough to the heat to survive, but not where instinct alone would have placed him. Stellan stood still for a moment, a split piece of firewood in his hand. "No," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's not normal." The puppy lowered his head onto his paws, but his ears remained angled toward the room. It reminded Stellan too much of trained K9s he had worked beside years ago. Dogs that slept in a state halfway between rest and assignment. Those had been full-grown working animals with extensive conditioning. This was a half-frozen young dog that should have known nothing except exhaustion and relief. Yet even now, with his body spent and his muscles still shivering from shock, he had chosen position over comfort. Stellan finished his tasks by habit that evening, checking the latch, clearing the stovepipe vent, setting a flashlight on the table, laying out a towel and old blanket in case the dog worsened overnight. But each task happened under a new awareness. He kept glancing toward the puppy. The dog kept noticing. Once, when the wind slammed adrift against the cabin wall, the puppy's head came up instantly, body taut, eyes fixed on the sound. Not wild, not startled, ready. Stellan felt something tighten in his chest. There were moments when a person could see too clearly that damage had come long before rescue. He slept badly in his chair near the stove, boots still on, waking every hour to check the puppy's breathing. Each time, he found those amber eyes half open in the dark. By morning, the storm had weakened, though the world outside remained buried under fresh snow. A pale, cold daylight leaked through the clouds, turning the clearing beyond the window into a blank white field, bordered by the black-green weight of pine. The cabin had warmed enough that the puppy's tremors had lessened. He could stand now, but only barely. His legs shook, yet he compensated with a kind of determined balance that made him look older than he was. Stellan set out food and water again. The puppy ate more this time, still quietly, still with those pauses to observe the room between bites. Around mid-morning, tires sounded faintly from the road beyond the trees. Stellan's body reacted before thought did. He turned his head, listening, while the puppy pivoted instantly toward the door. A few minutes later, there came a knock. Firm, not hesitant. Stellan opened the door to find Mara Bell on the porch with a young boy beside her, both dusted with flakes from the wind that still moved through the trees. Mara was in her mid-30s, tall and fine-boned with chestnut-brown hair tucked into a knit cap and a face that carried intelligence before beauty. Her features were steady rather than delicate. Clear eyes the color of hazel in winter light, a calm mouth, and the posture of someone who spent a great deal of time holding herself together for practical reasons, instead of dramatic ones. She worked at the town library and managed community donations when winter hit. People harder than pride let them admit. She was known in town as the sort of woman who noticed what others overlooked and remembered details long after everyone else had moved on. Beside her stood Nolan Bell, her 10-year-old son, bundled in a navy parka with a wool hat pulled low over dark hair that never seemed fully tame. His face had that quick, alert openness some children carried before the world, taught them to hide what they observed. He held an old pair of compact binoculars, hanging from his neck, as if they were part of his natural anatomy. "I heard you picked up a dog in the storm," Mara said, breath misting in the cold air. "Mrs. Tenley told half the road before breakfast." Stellan stepped back to let them in. "News moves fast. It's a small town," she said simply, "and people worry when an animal turns up out there." Nolan entered first with the restless curiosity of a boy, trying not to seem too excited. He stopped the moment he saw the puppy near the stove. Something in his expression changed. Not childish delight exactly, but a softer concentration. "He's smaller than I thought," he said. "He was freezing," Stellan replied. Mara removed her gloves and crouched slowly, showing the same patience one used with frightened animals and wary people. The puppy watched her approach, but did not retreat. Nolan knelt a little farther back, respectful in the instinctive way children can be when they truly care. "Hey there," he whispered. "You made it." The puppy's ears twitched toward the sound. Mara studied the dog with a seriousness Stellan appreciated. She did not rush to pet him or coo over him. She observed first. "You're right," she said quietly after a moment. "He doesn't act like a normal abandoned pup." She reached out and let the dog smell her hand. He did, then looked at her face, then at Nolan, then toward the door. Mara's brow tightened slightly. "May I?" she asked Stellan. He nodded. She ran careful fingers along the dog's shoulder, then paused. "There," she said. "Do you feel that?" Stellan crossed the room and knelt beside her. Under the fur, near the upper shoulder blade, was a small firm shape beneath the skin. Not a knot from injury, not a bone, something inserted. Mara looked up, and for the first time, there was real concern in her eyes. "That's not right." At that exact moment, the puppy did something that silenced the room. He turned away from both of them, hobbled 2 unsteady steps toward the front window, and stood staring at the tree line with his whole body gone rigid. It was not fear. It was recognition. The stove cracked softly behind them. Wind brushed the eaves. No vehicle sounded on the road. No figure moved outside. Yet the little dog remained fixed on one patch of forest as if someone invisible had just stepped into view. Nolan, who had gone still, lowered his voice almost to a breath. "Mom," he said, "that's the same way search dogs look when they lock onto something." Mara's hand rested unconsciously over her own chest. Stellan did not answer. For a long second none of them moved, and a strange feeling passed through the room. Not quite fear, not quite wonder, but the sense that something had entered before anyone had opened the door. Then the puppy blinked. The tension eased slightly from his posture, and he turned back as though whatever he had sensed had gone. The moment passed, but it left behind a different kind of silence, one that felt less empty than charged. Mara exhaled first. "I was going to suggest a vet anyway," she said, still watching the puppy. "Now, I'm not suggesting. I'm insisting." Nolan remained kneeling, his eyes bright in a way that told Stellan the boy was assembling patterns faster than he could yet explain them. "I've seen trucks out there," Nolan said suddenly. "Not on the main road. In the deeper section west of the ridge. On snow nights." Mara gave him a quick look. "Nolan, I'm serious." He pulled off one glove and pointed vaguely toward the forest. "Near the old ranger route, the one by Black Hollow. They don't use headlights until late, and sometimes the plates are covered in slush or mud." His voice had lost all childish play. "I saw them twice from Miller's Hill with the binoculars." Stellan studied him. Children exaggerated sometimes, but not like this. Nolan wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was reporting. "When?" Stellan asked. "The last few weeks," Nolan said. "Only when it snows hard. I thought maybe snowmobiles at first, but the sound was wrong. Bigger engines, and they always went in the same direction." Mara sighed softly, one of those quiet sounds that held the weight of a parent deciding whether to dismiss something or admit it mattered. "He notices things," she said, "usually more than he should." Stellan looked toward the window, where the puppy had stood staring. He thought of the SUV disappearing through the storm the previous day. The cut collar, the scars, the hard shape beneath the skin. He had spent years building a life that required as little from other people as possible. It was cleaner that way, simpler, but simplicity had already ended the moment he stopped that truck in the snow. The cabin no longer held only his silence. It held a wounded animal that behaved like a trained survivor, a woman who saw the wrongness of details at a glance, and a boy whose odd observations no longer sounded easy to ignore. Stellan did not believe in signs. He believed in evidence, instinct, and consequences. Yet sitting there in the warm cabin while snow drifted off the pines outside, he could not shake the growing sense that the puppy was more than something he had found. The little animal was a thread, and now that thread had begun to pull. By the time Mara and Nolan left that afternoon, light was already fading again behind the clouds. Mara promised to call the local vet and arrange a scan for the object under the skin. Nolan paused at the door before stepping out and looked back at the puppy. "He's not just lost," he said with quiet certainty. "He came from somewhere." Then he followed his mother into the sun. Stellan closed the door and stood listening to their car drive away. Behind him, the puppy had resumed his place where he could see both the stove and the entrance. The room was warm now. The blanket was dry. Food had been eaten, but none of that made the cabin feel safer. It only made the mystery clearer. Stellan sat slowly in the chair near the fire, elbows on his knees, and looked at the dog. The puppy looked back. Outside, the forest waited under deepening snow, wide and beautiful and full of the kind of distance that could hide almost anything. Inside, the smallest living thing in the room had become the heaviest fact Stellan could no longer set aside. The next morning arrived pale and brittle, as if the storm had wrung all warmth out of the sky and left only light behind. Snow lay deep around Stellan Cross's cabin, smoothing the clearing into a white silence, broken only by the occasional drop of meltwater from the eaves and the distant creak of pines shifting under their burden. Inside, the fire had burned low overnight, but the cabin still held enough heat to keep the air from biting. The puppy was stronger than he had been the day before. Not strong in the way a healthy young dog should have been. There was still too much narrowness in his body, too much care in the way he moved, but strong enough to stand on all four legs without swaying. He had begun following Stellan with his eyes even more closely now, and when Stellan crossed the room to pull on his coat, the little Malinois rose from his blanket and watched as if he understood departure, before he understood safety. Stellan knelt by him, one hand resting lightly against the small neck. "We're getting that shoulder checked," he said. "You don't get a vote." The puppy blinked once and held still, though his ears twitched toward the door at the sound of tires approaching outside. Mara Bell arrived in her dark wagon with Nolan in the passenger seat, both of them wrapped in layers against the hard Montana cold. In morning light, Mara looked less like the quiet library woman most people knew, and more like someone built by necessity. Her olive-green field jacket was practical and worn at the cuffs, her chestnut hair tied back in a low knot under a knit cap, and there was a steadiness in her face that came from carrying too many small responsibilities without complaint. Nolan hopped out with more energy than the day before, though his eyes went immediately to the puppy when Stellan opened the door. The boy had the same alertness he'd shown in the cabin, only brighter in daylight. Dark hair always a little untidy, lean shoulders inside his winter parka, binoculars still hanging from his neck as if he might need them at any second. "He looks better," Nolan said, relief coming out before he could hide it. "He looks watchful," Stellan replied. "That's not the same thing." Mara glanced at the puppy in Stellan's arms and nodded toward the truck. "Dr. Rowan said she'd meet us early before the rest of the town shows up with farm dogs and frostbitten cats." The drive down from the forest to the foothill town took nearly 40 minutes. The roads had been plowed, but only in the reluctant way rural counties managed after a heavy storm, with ridges of dirty snow banked along the edges and stretches of packed ice still gleaming beneath fresh powder. The puppy sat wrapped in a blanket across Stellan's lap for most of the drive, too restless now to remain motionless on the seat, and too weak to hold himself upright for long. Yet even there, his body told its own story. Every time a diesel pickup passed in the opposite lane, His muscles tightened. Every time a truck engine echoed somewhere beyond the trees, his head lifted sharply. Once, when an old forestry rig growled up a side road ahead of them, the puppy froze so completely that even his breath seemed to stop for a beat. Stellan felt it beneath his hand and said nothing. Mara, driving, noticed the silence all the same. "He keeps doing that?" she asked quietly. "Only with certain engines," Stellan said. Nolan twisted in his seat to look, like he knows the sound. Stellan did not answer, but the thought settled into him with uncomfortable weight. The veterinary clinic stood on the edge of town, near the highway turnoff. A low rectangular building of gray siding and stone with a hand-painted sign that read, "Rowan Veterinary Care." Snow had been shoveled from the walkway, though drifts still crowded the fence line. Inside, warmth and the clean medicinal smell of antiseptic mixed with wet fur and pine-scented cleaner. Dr. Eliza Rowan emerged from the back room with the brisk efficiency of someone whose time was always in demand and never wasted. She was in her late 40s, tall and spare with ash-blonde hair pulled into a no-nonsense knot, rectangular glasses low on her nose, and the kind of face that looked stern from a distance, until one noticed how carefully she handled frightened animals. Years of mountain practice had given her a directness that people either trusted immediately or mistook for severity. She took one look at the puppy in Stellan's arms and said, "Let's get him on the table before he decides all of us are idiots." The examination room was small but neat, its cabinets orderly, metal instruments gleaming under bright overhead lights. The puppy stood on the steel table with stiff-legged caution, watching each of them in turn. Dr. Rowan checked his gums, his eyes, his paws, the scars along the shoulder, when she ran practiced fingers along the left side of his neck and upper shoulder. Her mouth flattened slightly. "There's definitely an implant," she said, "but it isn't where most civilian vets place a chip." Mara folded her arms. "Can you scan it?" "I can try." She lifted a handheld reader from the counter and passed it slowly over the puppy's body. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the device gave a soft electronic chirp. The puppy stiffened so suddenly that Stellan had to place a hand on the table beside him to steady him. Dr. Rowan frowned at the small screen. "That's unusual?" Nolan leaned forward before Mara gently touched his sleeve. "What is it?" he asked. Dr. Rowan read silently for several seconds, then looked up. "It's not a standard pet registry. It's encrypted under a private identifier system." Stellan's voice stayed level. Meaning whoever chipped him wasn't planning on him being found through normal channels. Dr. Rowan plugged the scanner into her clinic computer and tried a different database. The puppy had gone utterly still now, eyes fixed on the machine, as if the faint electronic hum meant more to him than it did to any of them. Mara noticed it too. "He recognizes the sound," she said. Dr. Rowan clicked through screens, then stopped. The room seemed to narrow around her expression. "Well," she said at last, "that's the first problem." "There's more than one?" Stellan asked. "There usually is." She turned the monitor slightly. On the screen sat a stripped-down identification record with almost no useful public information, no owner listed, no municipal registration, no veterinary chain, only a code block, a restricted tag, and one reference line. Black Hollow Land Management and Working Dog Evaluation Unit. Nolan stared at the words as if they had been waiting for him personally. Mara's face lost color, not dramatically but enough for Stellan to notice. "Black Hollow," she repeated. "That ranger station was shut down years ago." Dr. Rowan removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Apparently not everything connected to it disappeared." The words settled heavily among them. For Stellan, the room seemed to sharpen at the edges. The old SUV in the trees, the cut collar, the scars, the puppy's silence. Each detail began locking into something larger. Dr. Rowan continued the examination with greater care now, measuring bone structure, checking the joints, testing reaction time with small movements of her hand. "He's undersized," she said finally. "Not malnourished in the simple sense. There's no obvious starvation pattern, but he's definitely small for a Malinois this age." Nolan looked down at the puppy with fresh protectiveness. "Can he catch up?" Dr. Rowan gave the answer of an honest doctor. "Maybe. Maybe not. Growth issues can come from several things: genetics, hormone disruption, stress at the wrong stage. But this much I can tell you. Whatever he's been through, it wasn't normal training, and it wasn't ordinary handling." She tapped the scars gently with one finger. Repeated injections would fit. At that moment, the puppy turned his head sharply toward a narrow shelf in the corner, where an old battery radio sat humming with static between stations. It was a harmless little thing the clinic kept for weather alerts, but the change in him was immediate. His ears lifted, his pupils widened, and a tremor passed through his body that had nothing to do with cold. He stared at the radio so intently that Stellan felt a chill along his own spine. Dr. Rowan, noticing, reached over and switched it off. The puppy did not relax right away. Instead, he looked past the dead radio to the clinic window facing northwest, and for one brief, impossible second, there was something in his face that looked less like fear than memory. Nolan whispered, almost involuntarily, "He's trying to place it." No one told the boy to be quiet. No one could. That moment had the weight of a truth no one in the room yet understood. Then, the puppy blinked. The tension eased slightly, and he lowered himself back onto the table, breathing harder than before. Dr. Rowan looked from the dog to Stellan. "Take that seriously," she said. Whatever environment he came from, sound mattered there. They left the clinic with more questions than they had brought in, and all of them were heavier. Mara went directly to the library, after dropping Nolan at school for the afternoon. The town library sat in an old brick building on Main Street, more functional than charming, with creaking floors and narrow windows that held winter light like cold water. Mara moved through its archive room with practiced familiarity, shrugging off her coat, tying her hair back again, and waking the old microfilm reader with a firmness that suggested it had disappointed her before. By instinct and training, she was a gatherer of fragments, a woman who had spent years putting order to records other people forgot mattered. She searched town council minutes, county transfer notices, forestry maps, and archived local papers. What she found was not a story so much as a pattern of absence. Black Hollow Ranger Station had indeed been closed after a supply shed fire more than 10 years earlier. The closure report was thin. The insurance record was thinner. Most strange of all, the land parcel transfer that should have followed was nearly invisible. Just a buried notation that several surrounding tracts had passed into private management under an umbrella contract with a conservation and land use group. No public hearing transcript, no detailed sale summary. It was the kind of administrative erasure that happened only when someone wanted a thing forgotten, without the noise of destroying it completely. That evening she carried copies of the records to Stellan's cabin, where Nolan already had topographic maps spread across the table like a commander planning a campaign. The boy's cheeks were red from the cold, and from excitement held barely in check. "Look," he said before anyone had fully sat down. His finger traced a set of thin forest routes on an old service map. "The trucks I told you about don't take the county road here." He moved to another line. "They peel off west and come in from the old maintenance spur. That route circles around where the patrol station used to be." Stellan studied the map. Nolan was right. The pattern avoided the obvious approach. Mara laid her archive copies beside it. "And almost everything public about Black Hollow dries up after the fire," she said. "It's not just shut down. It's been administratively buried." Stellan looked toward the puppy who had been resting near the stove. At the sound of Nolan's finger tapping the northwest section of the map, the little dog lifted his head. Outside, darkness had settled over the trees again. Wind moved softly through the pines, carrying the distant smell of cold sap and snow. Inside, the puppy rose slowly and crossed the room, no longer wobbling as much as before. He came to the table, placed both front paws against Stellan's leg, and turned his face toward the northwest window. Then, just as another far-off engine sound rolled faintly through the forest from beyond the ridge, every muscle in his body tightened. He did not bark. He did not whine. He went rigid and stared. Stellan followed the line instinctively, though there was nothing visible beyond darkness and trees. Yet now the direction meant something. Northwest, diesel, static, black hollow. He stood very still, one hand resting on the puppy's back. Mara saw the decision forming before he said anything. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not tonight." "Not tonight," Stellan agreed. He was too disciplined to move on impulse, and too familiar with terrain work to make a blind approach in full dark after fresh snow. But the answer had already taken shape in him. He could feel it the way he once felt mission parameters locking into place. No drama, no speech, just a narrowing path. "Tomorrow," he said. The next day dawned cold and colorless. Stellan left before full morning, moving alone through the forest with the old service map, folded inside his jacket, and his truck, parked well short of the area Nolan had marked. He had argued with himself about bringing the puppy and lost the argument the moment the little dog refused to stay behind, planting himself by the cabin door with a stubbornness too deliberate to ignore. So now, the pup moved beside him through knee-deep snow, still small, still not fully recovered, but driven by something stronger than comfort. The woods grew denser as they headed northwest. Old maintenance posts half buried in drifts appeared now and then, and once he found a broken signboard with only the ghost of lettering remaining. Black Hollow had not vanished. It had been left to sink. By midday he reached what had once been the outer boundary, a collapsed stretch of chain-link fencing bowed under snow, tangled with brush and rusted enough to look abandoned from a distance. On the other side, the trees thinned around what might once have been an access lane. Stellan crouched, scanning for fresh tracks, and saw them almost at once. Tire compression beneath newer snowfall, boot marks at least 2 days old, drag lines near one fence opening. The puppy came up beside him, nose testing the air. Then, something changed. The little Malinois went motionless, the fur along his spine lifting. His lips parted just enough for sound to form. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was only a low, rough, uncertain growl, the first voice he had given to the world since Stellan found him freezing in the road. In that fragile sound was fear, warning and recognition all at once. Stellan felt the back of his neck go cold. He looked through the broken fence into the silent trees beyond and understood with absolute certainty that whatever had shaped this animal was close enough now to be remembered. The low growl faded almost as soon as it began, but it changed the shape of the world around Stellan Cross more than any shouted warning could have done. He remained crouched beside the collapsed fence, one gloved hand resting lightly against the puppy's narrow chest, feeling the rapid movement of breath beneath the fur. Beyond the sagging chain link, Black Hollow lay under a cold, clean light that made everything look exposed and abandoned at the same time. Snow covered the ground in long white plains broken by black stumps, splintered rail posts, and the dark bones of old structures left to weather in silence. From a distance, the place might have passed for exactly what the county records claimed it was: a dead ranger outpost swallowed by time, rot, and harsh winters. But distance was a liar. Up close, Stellan could already see too many things that did not belong to ruins. The old access lane beyond the fence still held a compressed shape under the snow where heavier tires had passed and then been dusted over by later weather. A section of wire near one fence opening had been bent back recently, not by years of sagging but by hands that expected to come through again. Even the silence felt wrong. Truly abandoned places had a kind of loose stillness to them, a weather-softened indifference. This place held itself tighter, as if waiting to see who had entered it. The puppy stood beside him on uncertain legs, every line of his small body drawn toward the property. He was still too thin, still recovering, still young enough that his paws should have looked clumsy in snow this deep. Yet his posture was not that of a lost animal overwhelmed by unfamiliar ground. It was caution shaped by recognition. His ears angled forward, his head stayed low. He glanced not at the largest buildings first, but at the empty spaces between them, the gaps where sightlines crossed. Stellan had seen grown men with less discipline under pressure. The sight of it made something bitter turn in him. Whatever had been done to the little dog, it had been done systematically. He studied the open lane one last time, then slid through the bent fence and moved in with the steady patience of a man who trusted silence more than speed. The puppy followed at his left side without being called, placing his paws with unnatural care, almost as if he had learned not to disturb loose debris. The first structure they passed had once been an equipment shed. The roof sagged under old storm damage, and one wall leaned outward enough that daylight cut through the seams. But the padlock hanging there was new, steel bright beneath a skin of frost. Stellan did not touch it. He kept going, eyes moving from building to building, noting the watchtower with its broken stairs, the garage half buried in drifted snow, the detached storage unit behind it. There were footprints near that one, partially filled by fresh powder, but not old enough to have lost their edges completely. One man, maybe two, heavy winter boots. The drag marks nearby told another part of the story. A container or crate had been pulled from one doorway to another not long ago. He crouched near the track and pressed 2 fingers into the indentation. The snow beneath the top layer was still compact, not yet melted and refrozen hard, recent. He and the puppy moved deeper into the compound. The old station buildings formed a rough horseshoe around a packed yard where radio trucks or ranger vehicles must once have parked. In one corner stood the remnants of a training ring, posts, half-fallen fencing, and metal loops bolted into concrete. Time had damaged it, but not enough to hide its original purpose. The puppy stopped when he saw it. He did not growl again. He did not make any sound at all. He only froze and stared at the ring with those dark amber eyes gone flat and distant, the way people sometimes looked when memory had reached them before they were ready. Stellan waited a beat, then another. "You know this place," he said quietly. The puppy did not look at him. Stellan hated how certain the answer already felt. He chose the detached storage building at the back of the yard because it looked too ugly and too practical to have been left empty if the place was still being used. The door stood slightly crooked in its frame, but the snow around the threshold had been disturbed within the last day or two. He eased it open with controlled pressure, wincing at the faint scrape of metal on wood. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and carried the layered smell of oil, wet rope, damp cedar, old smoke, and something sharper beneath it. Bleach, maybe, or disinfectant. Weak daylight filtered through a grime-coated window near the rafters. Shelves lined one wall, some collapsed, some standing. At first glance, the room looked like a dumping place for forgotten gear. At second glance, the pattern changed. There were 2 small steel kennels set against the far wall, not large enough for full-grown working dogs. Not transport crates either. Holding cages. A length of braided lead hung from one hook, and beside it were restraint straps stiff with use. On a low table sat several dented tins of ration-style dog food with the commercial labels torn off. A stack of folded thermal blankets lay too neatly arranged to have been abandoned in a fire-shut station. Stellan's gaze moved to a half-burned trash barrel in the corner. Charred paper curled against blackened metal, some sheets reduced to lace, some still holding fragments of text. He crouched, sorting carefully through the least damaged pieces. The puppy stood just inside the doorway, facing outward as if instinct told him the room mattered, but not as much as whoever might return to it. The pages were badly scorched, but enough remained to form meaning. Stellan read phrases rather than full lines. Climatic resilience profile, response conditioning, juvenile unit, field adaptation under prolonged exposure, failure thresholds. Then one phrase that stopped him completely. Evaluation program for extreme environment suitability. It was typed, official-looking, and accompanied by a code string similar to the one Dr. Rowan had found. Nearby lay another scrap with dates and initials, and a third page that appeared to record feed intervals, sedation notes, and behavioral compliance markers. The language infuriated him precisely because it was so tidy. There was no cruelty in the wording. Only process. Process was often worse. People capable of brutality liked technical language because it allowed them to move pain from the realm of conscience into the realm of procedure. He reached for another half-burned sheet and noticed marks on the floor beside the barrel. Boot prints overlapping older stains. Black ash crushed under a recent heel. Someone had tried to destroy records here and had either been interrupted or become careless. Stellan folded the readable scraps into his inner jacket pocket. On a shelf above the barrel sat a small military-style field radio with its battery pack removed, and beside it a notebook, swollen from moisture. He opened the notebook carefully. Most pages were blank or smeared, but several held columns of numbers and abbreviations, plus repeated directional references that looked like route timings. West spur, north cut, secondary intake. None of it made full sense yet, but it had the ugly feel of an operation that had gone on long enough to become routine. Then, halfway through the notebook, he found a name. Not a person, a designation. K9, Juvenile, Transfer Group, Bay. Under it were 4 short entries, 3 crossed out heavily, 1 left uncrossed. The final uncrossed line ended in a number that matched the last 4 digits Dr. Rowan had shown them from the implant registry. Stellan went still. He looked toward the puppy. The little Malinois was facing the doorway, ears high, body tight, every muscle listening. Stellan's chest filled with a quiet, dangerous anger. It was no longer suspicion. The dog had not been dumped after wandering too far from somebody's property. He had come out of this place. A sound touched the far side of the compound, faint, metallic, and gone. Not wind, not settling wood, something handled. Stellan closed the notebook instantly. The puppy turned and met his eyes. For one brief second, something passed between them that felt too clear to be called instinct alone. Not panic, not confusion, but agreement. Stellan crossed to the doorway and listened. Another sound followed, this time a heavier one. An exterior door somewhere shutting with care, rather than slamming in haste. He drew back into the shadows of the storage room and scanned the yard through a crack in the jamb. A vehicle was not visible from this angle, but movement flickered between the structures near the old garage. One figure, then another, farther back. Winter coats dark against snow, slow pace, familiar with the ground. The moment tightened. Black Hollow had not been left to weather. It had a rhythm. People came and went, supplies were moved, records were burned, young animals were evaluated like equipment, and now whoever maintained that rhythm was returning. Stellan lowered to one knee beside the puppy. "We're leaving," he whispered. The dog did not hesitate. That alone chilled him. A normal pup might have needed coaxing, reassurance, command, This one pivoted immediately toward the rear wall, as if he already knew the room had a second exit. Stellan followed his gaze and saw it. A warped service hatch, half covered by a stack of broken crates. He moved them aside with controlled speed, eased the hatch open, and found a narrow drainage path beyond it dropping into brush and snow behind the storage row. Smart. Hidden from the main yard and shielded by old planks and brush. The sort of exit used by people who planned for discovery. He slipped through first, then reached back to guide the puppy down. The dog landed awkwardly, favoring one forepaw for half a step, then recovered. They moved along the drainage line crouched low, using the shadow of the back structures to cover them, until they reached the tree edge beyond the compound. Voices carried faintly now, too distant to make out words, but close enough to confirm more than one person was on site. Once among the pines, Stellan angled downslope toward the frozen creek bed he had crossed an hour earlier. Snow in open ground would hold fresh tracks too clearly, but the creek offered concealment, packed ice, and broken lines of sight. The puppy stayed with him, not underfoot, not wandering, always just where a trained partner might have moved. That fact would have been impressive in another context. Here it was heartbreaking. The retreat through the forest demanded a kind of patience that looked from the outside like almost nothing at all. Stellan did not run. Running through timber made noise, left slashes in snow, and narrowed judgment. He picked terrain. He used the creek whenever branches opened too wide around them. He paused often enough to listen for pursuit, and changed direction twice where old blowdowns created natural barriers. Above them, the afternoon sun threw a thin, cold brightness through the trees, and the snow reflected it upward, so that the whole forest seemed lit from the ground. Beautiful country if a man didn't know what could be hidden inside it. Once, while crossing beneath a stand of dead larch, he heard an engine start somewhere, near the compound. Not close, not immediate, but enough to force a decision. He veered farther east than his approach route and cut through a tangle of young fir, where no vehicle could follow, and no clear track would remain. Halfway down the frozen creek, the puppy stumbled, not from confusion, from fatigue. Stellan caught him before he fell fully, lifting him briefly against his chest while he listened again. The little body was trembling with exertion, but the eyes stayed open, fixed over Stellan's shoulder toward the direction they had come from. "Almost there," Stellan said, though the words were as much command as comfort. He set the dog down only when the footing improved and slowed the pace. For the first time since entering Black Hollow, he allowed himself to think beyond the next tree. What he had seen in that storage room could not be explained away as an old ranger station, occasionally used by trespassers. The cages were active use. The supplies were current. The records described deliberate conditioning. The dog at his side had a numbered place in that system, which meant someone, somewhere, knew he was missing. By the time the cabin clearing came into view through the trees, dusk had begun draining the color from the snow. Stellan checked the perimeter before approaching, an old habit now sharpened by necessity. No fresh tire marks near the road, no sign of disturbance at the porch. Still, he circled once before going in. Inside, warmth greeted them slowly, and the ordinary details of the room, the stove, the workbench, the folded blankets, felt almost unreal after Black Hollow's stripped efficiency. He shut the door, set the recovered papers and notebook on the table, then crouched beside the puppy. The dog had gone straight to the spot near the door where he could see the room. Not the stove, not the blanket. The door. Again. Always the door. Stellan brought water, then food softened with broth. This time the puppy ate more than before, but between bites he kept glancing toward the windows, toward the walls, toward Stellan's hands. It was not fear of him. It was the lived expectation that a place of temporary safety could be interrupted at any time. Watching that was worse than anything in the burned records. Stellan sat on the floor across from him, forearms on his knees, and let the anger settle into something colder and more useful. He had once built his life around walking toward danger, because duty demanded it. Then he had built a different life by refusing to walk toward anything at all unless it was broken machinery or a neighbor's winter problem. But Black Hollow had changed the terms. Whatever operation lived out there in the forest had done more than mistreat an animal. It had taken youth, instinct, trust, and turned them into measurable output. The little Malinois had not been lost in the snow. He had escaped a place designed to erase the difference between living creature and working asset. Night closed over the cabin. The wind outside had calmed, leaving the pines in a stillness almost tender. Stellan fed more wood into the stove and returned to the table, unfolding the charred pages again beneath the lamp. Behind him, the puppy settled at last without fully resting, small body curled but ears alert. Stellan read the surviving lines until the words blurred into a pattern of controlled cruelty and institutional caution. He did not yet know who owned Black Hollow now, how many people were involved, or how wide the truth around it ran. He only knew one thing with complete certainty. The dog sleeping in fragments by his door had not wandered out of a mystery. He had come out of a system, and the people behind that system had gone to careful lengths to make sure no one would ever know it was still alive. The night after Black Hollow did not leave Stellan cross, gently. He slept in fragments, if what he did could still be called sleep, waking to every small shift in the cabin as if the old station had followed him home in pieces. The stove settled with a metallic click. Wind brushed snow against the outer wall. Once, a pine branch dumped its burden onto the roof in a muffled slide, and Stellan's eyes opened before the sound had fully ended. Each time he woke, he looked first toward the door. Each time he found the puppy there, or near there, curled but not surrendered to rest, his small body arranged in a line that gave him sight of the entrance and the windows both. That sight did something to Stellan he could not easily name. Anger was part of it, so was pity, but beneath both was something more difficult, because it carried responsibility. The cabin had once been a place where nothing living needed anything from him except the minimum. Now, every time he looked at the little Malinois, he saw proof that someone had taken a creature built for loyalty and taught it vigilance before trust. The dog was too young to carry that much caution, honestly. Yet he carried it anyway. Morning came hard and white. Snowlight filled the clearing outside with a brightness that made the world seem clean, even when nothing about it was. Stellan sat at the table with the charred pages and the damp notebook he had taken from Black Hollow spread beneath the lamp. He had dried them near the stove through the night, turning the pages with slow care whenever he woke. In the cold clarity of morning, the fragments said the same thing they had said in the dark, only more plainly. There were coded references to evaluation cycles, cold endurance, conditioned response, juvenile transfer groupings, and a language of operational neatness that stripped life down to measurable output. Some of the pages had numbers where names should have been. Others contained inventory-style abbreviations that suggested routes, quantities, and movement schedules. Stellan had seen enough bureaucratic cruelty in his life to understand that evil often preferred clipboards to shouting. He rubbed a hand over his jaw and leaned back, staring at the page where the pup's final 4 chip digits appeared beneath the crossed-out designations of other young dogs. The unmarked line looked small, but it had weight. It meant survival or escape, maybe both. The puppy woke when Stellan stood, not because of noise but because his body seemed tuned to motion. He rose from the blanket in a single smooth effort, paused as if making sure his legs would obey, and then followed Stellan to the stove where breakfast was being warmed. The habit had become visible already, room to room, door to table, table to sink, never underfoot, never wandering aimlessly, always placing himself where he could see and evaluate. Stellan softened more food with broth and set it down. The dog ate with more energy now, but still with that careful restraint that never looked like simple manners. Halfway through the bowl, a truck passed on the distant road below the ridge, too far to be seen from the cabin, but near enough for the low diesel note to travel through the trees. The puppy stopped eating instantly. His whole body tightened, ears lifting, eyes cutting toward the northwest window. Stellan waited until the sound faded, then crouched beside him and rested a hand on the small shoulder. The flesh beneath his fingers was warmer than it had been days ago. Stronger, too, but still too slight. "You're not going back there," he said quietly. The puppy turned his head toward him, and for the first time, there was something in the look that was not only assessment. It was not trust yet, not fully, but it was awareness that the words were meant as protection. Maribel arrived before noon with a stack of copied records bound by a thick red elastic band and a face that told him she had not spent her morning doing ordinary library work. She came in without ceremony, stamping snow from her boots on the porch, her olive field jacket powdered white at the shoulders. Today she looked tired beneath the steadiness, the faint shadows under her hazel eyes making her seem older than 34, though not weaker. She was the kind of woman whose exhaustion always seemed to deepen rather than diminish her. "I found more," she said, laying the records on the table. "And the more I find, the less I like any of it." The puppy watched her come in, then returned to his place near the door after a brief check of her expression, as if he had already decided she belonged within the narrow list of people who did not need guarding against. Mara noticed and gave a small, sad smile. "He's assigned me to the non-dangerous category. I'll take that as progress." She spread the papers out beside the charred documents from Black Hollow. County parcel maps, transfer records, insurance filings, business registrations. Stellan had never cared much for paperwork, but he had learned enough in life to recognize when paper trails mattered more than footprints. Mara pointed to one document after another, building the story carefully. After the fire at Black Hollow, the surrounding land wasn't left in county limbo as long as the public file suggests. It was transferred in pieces through 2 shell entities, then consolidated under one private group 3 years later. Stellan looked at the name typed near the bottom of a land use agreement. "Silas Vane," he read aloud. Mara nodded. "He owns half the respectable development in this county now. Timber restoration contracts, eco-tourism investments, fire mitigation grants, and that working dog rescue initiative he's always bragging about at fundraisers." Her mouth flattened slightly. "Only some of the internal references tied to those companies aren't about rescue. They're about evaluation units, climate suitability, and handler compliance." Stellan had heard the name, of course. Everyone in the region had. Silas Vane was the kind of man rural communities often attracted, and then regretted too late. Polished enough to charm town councils, wealthy enough to make resistance feel impractical, careful enough to frame private ambition as public benefit. Mara continued, tapping a second packet of papers. "I also paid a visit this morning to the sheriff's office. Deputy Cole Branner did not enjoy being dragged into this." Right on cue, a truck door thudded outside. A minute later, Deputy Cole Branner stepped into the cabin with the stiff reluctance of a man who had not intended to become part of someone else's trouble, and was irritated to find that trouble logical enough he could no longer dismiss it. Cole was close to 40, built broad through the shoulders with the contained physical confidence of someone used to long winters, bad roads, and disagreements that never stayed verbal for long. His deputy's jacket was dark brown with the county insignia on the shoulder, his boots wet to mid-calf from snow, and his face had the weathered plainness of a man who had spent more years outdoors than at desks. Short brown hair, a jaw that looked set even when he was quiet, pale gray eyes that missed little and trusted even less. He removed his gloves slowly, glanced once at the puppy, then at the papers, then at Stellan. "I'm not here officially," he said. "Then don't act officially," Stellan replied. Cole snorted once, not quite amused. "That I can manage." What made Cole useful was not warmth. It was the opposite. He distrusted stories that arrived too neatly, which meant he had spent half the morning trying to prove Mara wrong, and instead had found more reasons to worry. "There are old incident reports connected to Black Hollow that don't line up," he said, stepping closer to the table. "Patrol routes logged through roads that were supposedly closed. Fuel usage charged to vehicles that were no longer in service. A gap in county oversight after the fire that nobody can explain without using the phrase clerical transition." He said the last two words like he wanted to spit them out. "And Vane's companies show up near every missing piece." Mara folded her arms. "So now you believe us." Cole looked at her. "I believe enough not to ignore it." The puppy had been lying near the wall through most of the exchange, ears angling from voice to voice. Then as Cole laid a photocopied invoice onto the table, the dog rose abruptly and crossed the room. He did not go to Stellan. He went straight to Cole, stopped just outside the deputy's boots, and looked up at him with an intensity that changed the air between them. Cole chose, not out of fear, more from surprise. He had the posture of a man not used to animals approaching him for reasons other than training or warning. The pup sniffed once at the cuff of his pants where cold mud had dried in a dark streak, then sat down and held his gaze. For a brief second, something moved across Cole's face that had nothing to do with the case on the table. It was small, almost invisible, but Stellan saw it because he knew the look. An old grief touched unexpectedly. Cole's voice, when he spoke, came rougher than before. "I had a shepherd mix when I was 12. He said, not looking away from the dog. "Storm took down the river fence. Found him 3 days later, half frozen under a culvert. We brought him home. Thought he was gone. He stayed alive because he kept lifting his head every time my father called his name." The cabin went still around the memory. Cole exhaled once through his nose and added quieter, "Some things decide to live harder than they should have to." Then the moment passed. He straightened, but the edge in him had altered. He was no longer merely unconvinced law looking at suspicious paper. He was a man being reminded that what sat in the room was not evidence first. It was a living creature someone had used up and failed to finish. That changed how he stood, how he listened, how he looked toward the northwest tree line, visible beyond the glass. And it changed, too, the strange, quiet trust beginning to gather among the four of them. By late afternoon, the picture they assembled was ugly enough to make even the warm cabin feel colder. Silas Vane had not simply purchased remote land around an old ranger station. He had acquired a shield of isolation. Black Hollow sat inside that shield, hidden by legal layering and administrative fog. The more deeply Mara dug into filings, the clearer the pattern became. Vane's public-facing companies marketed sustainable logging consultation, search and rescue dog support, and winter terrain logistics. But the internal language scattered through grant drafts and subcontractor correspondence told another story. Enhancement protocols, behavioral reliability scoring, environmental tolerance benchmarks. Not rescue dogs. Designed dogs, or at least dogs pushed through systems meant to produce uniform outcomes. Cole found one county memo referencing a complaint filed years earlier by a seasonal worker who claimed he had heard animals crying at night near the old ranger tract. The note ended with no action taken. No follow-up, no officer assigned. It had simply disappeared into the bureaucratic dark where inconvenient truths often went to die. If they were treating litters like equipment, Mara said, voice tight with controlled anger, then what happened to the ones that didn't meet whatever standard they invented? No one answered immediately, because the silence was answer enough. As dusk came on, Nolan arrived from school on foot from the road, cheeks red from the cold, hat askew, carrying a rolled map tube under one arm as if he had been thinking about nothing else all day. The moment he entered, the puppy left his post by the door and went to him without hesitation, stopping close enough to touch, but not leaning in. Nolan knelt, setting the map aside, and smiled in that bright, careful way children do when they know joy might frighten something already hurt. "Hey," he whispered, "you're still here." The pup lowered his head for one brief second, until his forehead almost brushed Nolan's sleeve, then stepped back again. Mara saw it and pressed her lips together, because tenderness from damaged things always landed hardest on people who had learned to live carefully themselves. Nolan unrolled the map across the work table between the adult papers. He had marked routes in pencil, county roads, old Forest Service spurs, hunting paths, snowmobile cuts. "If they move in bad weather," he said, "they'd use the lower draw here because the ridge blocks visibility from Miller's Hill." Stellan studied him with new respect. The boy was not guessing. He was mapping from observation, memory, and terrain logic. "Who taught you to think like that?" Cole asked before he could stop himself. Nolan shrugged. "No one. I just pay attention." Evening settled fully outside. The pines at the edge of the clearing became black columns against a dim blue-gray sky. One by one, Mara gathered the copies into order while Cole copied notes into a smaller pad he could keep on his person without attracting notice. The puppy moved through the cabin more than usual now, following Stellan from table to stove, stove to window, window back to the chair. At one point, Stellan stepped into the back room to fetch another lantern, and when he turned, the pup was behind him, silent as breath. "You're going to make a habit of that," he said. The dog simply watched him. It was then, perhaps because the long day had worn down some protective part of him, that the name came out without planning. "Drift," Stellan said softly. "That's what I'm calling you." He thought of the wind-blown ribbons of snow across the road where he had found the puppy, of something nearly erased and still standing. The pup's ears tipped forward at the sound, not because he knew it, not yet, but because Stellan had spoken it like something meant to stay. "Drift," he repeated. The dog blinked once, then sat. Mara, passing through the doorway, heard it and said nothing for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had gentled. "It fits." Stellan looked down at the little Malinois and felt the weight of naming more than he expected. Names made things real. They made it harder to pretend this was temporary. Night had fully taken the forest by the time Mara and Nolan finally left. Cole followed 10 minutes later, pulling on his gloves with the expression of a man who disliked the road ahead but had accepted it. "I'll see what I can do without making noise," he said at the door. "If veins connected this deep, the wrong question to the wrong office, we'll travel fast." Stellan nodded. "Then don't ask questions yet." Cole hesitated, glanced once at Drift curled near the threshold, and then gave a short, grim nod before disappearing into the cold. The cabin felt quieter after the vehicles left, but not emptier. Stellan stacked the papers into a locked drawer beneath the workbench, banked the stove, and set fresh water near Drift's blanket. The little dog followed each step as though duty kept him tethered. He rarely played. He never bounced the way pups should. He did not investigate new objects with careless curiosity. Instead, he catalogued doors, windows, footsteps, tones of voice. Watching that hurt in a way Stellan had not anticipated. Wounds and scars were visible things. You could clean them, bandage them, measure them, but the loss of ordinary innocence, of the stupid, joyful trust a young animal should have had. That was damage without edges. It could only be witnessed. Later, while Stellan stood at the sink rinsing out the food bowl, Drift lifted his head sharply. It was not dramatic. No sound, no sudden movement, just an instant hardening that changed him from tired puppy to alert sentry. Stellan felt it before he understood it, and went still, hands wet in the basin. Drift turned toward the northwest window, the same direction from which the compound had hidden itself in the trees. His ears rose, his eyes narrowed slowly without taking his gaze off the darkness outside. He moved to the front of the cabin and stood beneath the window where the moonless night reflected nothing back. Stellan set the bowl down in silence and crossed the room one controlled step at a time. He did not switch on the porch light. He did not pull the curtain too quickly. He stopped just short of the glass and let his eyes adjust. At first there was only the clearing, pale with old snow, and the black wall of pine beyond it. Then, near the edge of the tree line, something changed. Not a person fully visible, not movement obvious enough for certainty, only the faint impression of shape, where shape should not have been. A darkness among darkness that held too still to be natural. Drift's body stayed rigid beside him, every line saying what words did not need to. Someone was out there, and whatever had survived the storm, the files and Black Hollow, had just reached the edge of Stellan's home. The shape at the tree line did not move for so long that Stellan Cross might have doubted it was there at all, if Drift had not been standing beside him like a wire pulled tight. The cabin lamp behind them threw only a muted amber glow, not enough to reach beyond the clearing, but enough to turn the window into a dark mirror where the snow outside reflected faintly blue beneath the moonless winter sky. Stellan kept his breathing even and did not go for the porch light. Men who watched from tree lines often wanted the person inside to announce fear before anything else. Drift's body remained rigid, head slightly lowered, ears forward, the fur along his narrow spine lifted just enough to tell the truth. Stellan leaned half an inch closer to the glass and saw it again. Not a full figure, not a face, just the clean absence of natural shape among the pines. Then, it was gone. Not vanished, withdrawn, deliberately. That made it worse. He stepped back from the window, every old instinct inside him slotting into place with a precision he had spent years trying not to need. "All right," he said softly, not to calm Drift, but to give the moment edges. "So now we know." He crossed the room in silence and opened the drawer beneath the workbench where the copied records and scorched Black Hollow documents were hidden. He separated them into two bundles almost automatically, his mind moving faster than emotion. One set he slid into a weatherproof pouch. The second he tucked beneath the false base of an old metal tool chest at the back wall. Drift followed him from station to station, not weaving underfoot like a normal young dog would have, but repositioning himself each time to keep the door and Stellan in the same line of awareness. Outside, the forest had gone still, in the way it only did when something with intent moved inside it. No coyote cries, no branch fall, no passing engine. Just silence stretched tight enough to feel. He called Mara first. She answered on the second ring, her voice low, as if she had already been awake and waiting for something to happen. He told her only what mattered. Someone had reached the clearing. The documents were split, and if she had the remaining copies at her place, she needed to move. There was a brief pause on her end, just long enough for him to picture her standing in her kitchen, one hand around the phone, the other already reaching for keys. "Nolan's asleep," she said. "Wake him," Stellan replied. "Take the lower service road, not town center. Don't come here." Her breath tightened, but her voice did not break. "Understood." He called Cole next. The deputy answered in a half-awake gruffness that vanished as soon as Stellan said, "They're here." By the time the words were out, Cole was fully present. How many? At least one at the line. Probably more. I'm on my way. Stellan looked at the window again. Come dark. No sirens. No county chatter. Cole did not ask why. Got it. Once the calls were done, the cabin felt smaller, but sharper, as if every object had chosen a side. The stove gave off a low, steady heat. The workbench, the sink, the narrow hallway to the back room, the door, the window angles, all of it became terrain. Stellan moved through the space, not as a man preparing for a fight he wanted, but as one making peace with the fact that avoidance had already ended. He shut off the front lamp and left only the stove glow and one dim lantern in the rear room. Then he stepped outside with Drift at his heel and studied the clearing in moonless blue. The snow reflected enough light to make the open ground dangerous. Anyone approaching across it would be visible, but anyone already in the timber could watch everything. He crossed quickly to the detached shed, 10 yards from the cabin, checked the side hatch, then returned by a different angle to break a clean pattern. Drift kept up. Still not fully grown, still too thin, but moving now with that controlled intensity that never failed to wound Stellan a little. Mara Bell did not panic beautifully because panic was not beautiful on people like her. It made them quieter. By the time she woke Nolan and got him into his coat, the fear in her had already narrowed into decisions. Her small house on the edge of town held the soft remnants of ordinary life. School papers at the table, library forms in a satchel, a half-folded blanket on the couch. But the moment she opened the file cabinet and lifted out the backup copies of land records, route maps, and handwritten notes tied to Black Hollow, the house stopped being home for a while and became another point in a line someone else might follow. Nolan, hat half on and cheeks still warm from sleep, understood enough not to ask childish questions. He had his mother's ability to read what was serious before anyone explained it. "We're taking the south route?" he asked. Mara nodded. "And you don't look out the windows unless I tell you." He swallowed and nodded back. For all his curiosity, he was still 10. His courage always came with the thin, transparent edge of childhood fear, which made it more real, not less. Back at the cabin, the first sign that the watchers had become movers came not from sight but from light. A brief white sweep passed between the trunks northwest of the clearing, too controlled for headlights, too narrow for moonshine. Flashlight beam, suppressed immediately. Stellan felt Drift tense beside his leg. Then, another beam appeared, farther right for less than a second, lower to the ground as if someone had crouched while scanning. 2, at least, maybe 3, organized enough not to announce themselves. Stellan drew a slow breath and moved back inside, leaving the front door unlatched. He did not intend to defend the cabin as a fixed point if he could help it. Fixed points burned, fixed points trapped. Instead, he meant to make the place uncertain, to blur where he was, where the records were, and where Drift would be, if they came in expecting a simple retrieval. The thought of the dog as an object in their minds ignited a cold fury in him that sat steady rather than hot. The re-hook came minutes later, in a way no plan could have produced. Drift, who had been standing near the door, suddenly broke pattern and trotted into the back room on his own. Stellan followed, expecting him to react to a sound or a scent. Instead, the little Malinois went straight to the old cedar chest beneath the rear window and pawed at it once, then twice. The chest had belonged to Stellan's late father, who had used it for fishing gear and later for things he did not know what to do with, after grief made objects feel heavier than they were. Stellan opened it quickly. Inside, beneath old wool, spare lantern mantles, and rusted tackle tins, lay the one thing he had not thought about in months. A handheld emergency locator beacon from his service years. Outdated for formal use but still functional on private rescue frequencies if the battery held. He stared at it, for half a breath. He had forgotten it was there. Drift had not known what it was, could not have known, and yet the dog had led him to the exact chest at the exact moment when a silent call for help might matter more than another gun or shouted warning. Stellan lifted the beacon, turned it over, and felt a strange pressure behind his ribs that had nothing to do with fear. Some moments in life arrive too precisely to be dismissed as chance, even by men who did not speak easily about faith. He looked down at Drift. "You keep doing that," he murmured, "and I'm going to run out of ways to explain you." The pup blinked and turned his head toward the outside wall. The moment already passed for him. For Stellan, it remained. Not a miracle. Not proof of anything simple. Just one more small, impossible kindness placed exactly where it was needed. He activated the beacon on a limited local channel used by volunteer winter search teams and old emergency relays, then sent a stripped-down distress burst to a number Cole had once given him for unofficial contact when radios were a bad idea. No names, no details, just coordinates and a son phrase meaning active threat near private residence. Then he killed the room light entirely. Outside, a low crunch came from the side of the cabin, not the porch, the side wall near the woodpile. Drift gave no bark, only a hard turn of the head and a low breath through his nose. Stellan moved to the shadow beside the inner hallway where he could see both the front entry and the side window. Another crunch. Another. Whoever was out there was testing approach, checking reactions. A man used to this kind of work would expect panic, maybe a shouted threat, maybe lights snapping on. Stellan gave them nothing. Mara's wagon moved through the lower service road beneath overhanging pines, headlights off whenever the track allowed, parking lamps only when the ruts turned too narrow to trust blind. Nolan sat rigid with the document satchel wedged between his boots, both hands wrapped around it as if the papers inside were living. Behind them, once, he thought he saw distant lights through the trees, but they vanished before he could be sure. Mara kept her face forward, jaw set, one hand tight on the wheel. She was not a woman built for combat, but she was built for endurance, and there were moments when endurance mattered more. The southern route curled around a frozen drainage cut and eventually met an older county spur that led toward town without passing near the main road above Black Hollow. That was why Stellan had chosen it. Hidden did not mean safe, but it meant less expected. At the cabin, the probing phase ended. Footsteps crossed the porch at last, light but not amateur. The front knob turned slowly once, then again. The unlatched door moved inward 2 inches on the third try. A figure in dark winter gear slipped into the dim entry, head down, one gloved hand extended, a narrow flashlight hooded against the palm. Another shadow moved past the side window. Stellan saw enough to know what mattered. No local uniforms, no county markings, no hesitation in the search pattern. These men were not worried about being seen by the wrong authority, because they did not expect any authority to matter before they were done. The first man took one more silent step and angled toward the room where the stove glow gave just enough light to suggest recent occupancy. Stellan shifted, not toward him but behind him, using the man's own expectation of forward threat. Drift, impossibly disciplined for a puppy, stayed low and back until the exact second the second intruder reached the side threshold. Then the pup launched not in a biting attack. He was too young, too small, but in a sharp, perfectly timed rush that struck the man's boot and shin from the blind side, just enough to break balance and force noise. The man stumbled with a muffled curse. Stellan moved instantly. The first intruder turned too late, catching only a blur before Stellan drove him offline into the table edge, hard enough to strip his flashlight loose. Wood cracked, papers scattered as decoys. The second man regained footing outside and came in fast from the side room. But the cabin was too tight now, two full of angles the intruders had not mapped, and Stellan had lived inside for years. He used the hallway corner, stove glare, and one overturned chair to split their movement and deny them the clean inside sweep they wanted. The fight remained as the night itself demanded, close, ugly, controlled and mostly silent except for breath, boots, wood impact, and the occasional curse forced through clenched teeth. No gunfire. Whoever had sent them wanted retrieval and erasure, not a public noise rolling through the valley. That choice saved Stellan's life as much as his own skill did. Drift kept moving at the edges, warning, redirecting, forcing hesitation with perfectly placed bursts of motion. Once, Stellan broke toward the back door and heard an engine outside through the trees. Coal. Good. But before relief could settle, one of the men cut in from a dead angle behind the stove, with a compact baton raised. Drift saw it first. The puppy hurled himself forward and planted squarely between them, not with the power of a grown dog, but with the terrible certainty of one who had already decided where he belonged. The split-second collision of fur, motion, and surprise bought Stellan the fraction he needed. He pivoted, caught the attacker's wrist, drove him down into the stove guard, and ended the strike before it landed clean. For one heartbeat, everything stopped inside him. Not around him. Around him there was still movement, harsh breath, the shout from outside as Cole's voice cut through the clearing, the crash of someone bolting through snow. But inside him, something old and buried shifted. Drift was on his feet again, shaking but standing, eyes locked upward as if asking the only question that mattered. Are we still in this? And Stellan knew then with a clarity so strong, it almost felt like pain that he had been wrong from the beginning. He had thought he was keeping a damaged creature alive out of duty, decency, and rage at what had been done to him. But that was only part of it. This small dog, shaped by cruelty and still choosing him, was doing something back. He was dragging Stellan toward the part of himself that once stood between danger and the vulnerable, without bargaining over the cost. Not the soldier shaped by orders, the better thing beneath him. The thing that knew protecting what was right was not the same as returning to war. Outside, Cole's truck lights slashed through the trees, and from somewhere farther down slope, another engine answered. Mara still moving, Nolan and the evidence still ahead of the net tightening behind them. The white forest held its breath, and in the narrow, warm wreckage of the cabin, Stellan put one hand on Drift's back, rose into the aftermath, and understood that whatever came next, neither of them was standing alone anymore. Morning came with a clarity so clean, it almost felt merciful. After the violence and breath-held darkness of the night before, the first light across the Montana forest seemed impossibly gentle. Sun rose low and pale over the eastern ridge, pouring through the pines in long bands of gold that turned the fresh snow into fields of shattered glass. Every branch carried a white edge. Every drift held blue shadow beneath its brightness. The world looked newly made, though Stellan Cross knew better than to trust appearances after all that had been hidden in beauty these past days. The cabin stood wounded, but standing. One chair lay broken near the stove. The front table bore a deep split, where a body had struck it in the dark. One window had cracked in a spreading starburst near the frame. But the walls still held. The fire still breathed heat into the room. And Drift, though stiff and tired from the night, was alive. That was the first thing Stellan checked when dawn fully reached the clearing. The little Malinois stood near the door, not with his old fragile rigidity now, but with the exhausted steadiness of something that had survived and had not yet learned what survival meant afterward. He was still too small for what he had already endured. His shoulders remained narrower than they should have been, and the scars beneath his fur had not disappeared, simply because daylight made the world seem clean. But he stood. When Stellan crouched beside him and ran both hands carefully along his ribs, legs, neck, and shoulders, Drift tolerated the inspection with that same disciplined patience that had once hurt Stellan to witness. This time, though, The pain was altered by something else. Drift flinched once near the left side, where he had hit the floor in the struggle, but there was no serious damage, beyond bruising and fatigue. Stellan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "You did enough," he said quietly. Drift looked at him, and for once the look held no guarded calculation, no searching for hidden threat, just attention, just presence. Cole Branner arrived before 8 with 2 state investigators and 1 county evidence van following his truck. He had not slept either. It showed in the roughness around his eyes and the harder set of his jaw, but there was something restored in him now as well, something that had gone missing in the slow corrosion of small-town compromise and routine. He had chosen his side during the night, not in words but in action, and daylight had only hardened that choice. The 2 state investigators who stepped out behind him carried the unmistakable air of people used to rural crime scenes, where what mattered was often buried under logistics, weather, and lies. The older of the 2 introduced herself as investigator Dana Mercer, a woman in her early 50s with weather-creased skin, dark hair threaded with gray and clipped short at the neck, and a face that did not waste expressions. She wore a charcoal field coat over plain work clothes and boots built for snow rather than office hallways. Her younger partner, Aaron Pike, was in his early 30s, clean-featured, compactly built, and attentive in the slightly tense way of a man trained to notice everything before deciding what to think. Neither carried the swagger of television law enforcement. They carried notebooks, sealed evidence bags, and the wary respect of people who knew the truth could be both fragile and inconvenient. The first hours of the morning moved quickly. Cole walked them through the cabin, showing entry points, footprint patterns near the tree line, and the places where the intruders had moved inside. Dana Mercer examined the room with the silence of someone building a timeline in her head, before she trusted anyone else's. Aaron photographed impact marks, broken wood, the disturbed snow, and the cloth pouch of records Stellan had kept ready. Stellan handed over the charred pages, the notebook from Black Hollow, the copies Mara had preserved, and the sequence of land records that tied the ranger station to Silas Vane's layered ownership. When Dana reached the evaluation sheets and the coded references to juvenile transfer groups, she went very still. "This is not rogue kennel paperwork," she said at last. "This is an organized program." Her tone remained neutral, but Stellan heard the anger under it, because he knew the sound of controlled anger in disciplined people. Cole nodded once. "You'll want to see the station itself." Dana looked toward the northwest tree line. "We're going." By mid-morning, Black Hollow no longer belonged to secrecy. County units sealed the access roads. State vehicles rolled through the old service spur Nolan had mapped. Dana Mercer led the evidence team through the collapsed boundary while Aaron Pike coordinated photographs, chain of custody, and site logging. The snow that had once hidden tire marks now preserved them. The steel kennels, the restraint leads, the burned barrel, the hidden service exit, the ration tins without labels, and the documentation scraps all emerged under professional scrutiny. What Stellan had seen alone in tense fragments became, in daylight and under procedure, something harder for the world to deny. Men from wildlife enforcement and agricultural oversight arrived before noon once the nature of the records became clear. By then, word had already begun to spread. In a place like this, truth never arrived quietly once it had a body. It moved from porch to diner to gas station to church steps faster than any official press release ever could. By the time Mara Bell reached town hall with Nolan and the final folder of copied maps and her own archive notes, people were already gathering in the parking lot in winter coats and knit caps, breath smoking in the bright, cold air. Mara looked different that morning. The old fatigue Stellan had noticed in her from years of carrying practical burdens had not vanished, but it had sharpened into purpose. There was strength in the way she moved now, in the way she carried the file box against her hip, as though what she protected was not only evidence, but the dignity of a place that had been quietly manipulated for too long. Nolan stayed close beside her, not shrinking behind adults anymore. He was still a boy. Dark hair wind-tossed, cheeks red, gloves mismatched because one had been left in the car the night before. But he was a boy standing inside the truth of what he had noticed. No one would be able to call him fanciful again without lying to themselves. The re-hook came not in chaos but in recognition. As the first official statements were being organized inside the town hall, Mara asked Nolan for the original topographic sheet he had penciled over. He unfolded it carefully across one end of a folding table, while Dana Mercer and Cole leaned in. Nolan's finger moved through the forest roots with a confidence that surprised several adults in the room. He traced the lower service cuts, the blind ridge lines, the hidden maintenance access around Black Hollow, then stopped at a narrow notch between two contour lines and said, "This is where they sowed in bad snow." The road doesn't show from Miller's Hill after that point, so if someone wanted to move crates or animals without being seen from the county line, this is where they'd do it. Dana looked at him for a long second, then at the map, then back again. "How old are you?" 10, Nolan said. Dana nodded once, the smallest shift in expression, touching her face. "Well, 10-year-old, you just explained a transport pattern half my field team hadn't fully visualized yet." The room held still for a heartbeat. Nolan glanced at Mara, unsure whether to be proud or embarrassed, and Mara's eyes filled before she could stop them. Not with theatrical tears, with the quiet, overwhelming ache of a mother seeing her child taken seriously by the world for something he had carried alone. In that moment, the mystery was no longer only about corruption exposed. It was also about overlooked truth being honored when it finally spoke in the right room. That feeling moved through the gathered people like warmth. It made them stand straighter. It made the day feel less like scandal and more like justice stepping into daylight. Silas Vane's fall began before noon. He arrived in town expecting perhaps to manage a narrative the way men like him always had, through smooth explanation, wounded offense, selective cooperation, and the practiced generosity of someone used to being treated as indispensable. He came in a dark wool coat, polished boots, and the composed expression of a man who had built his life on entering rooms as if they already belonged to him. He was in his mid-40s, clean-cut, handsome, in the expensive, forgettable way money often produced. His dark hair immaculate despite the cold, his voice low and persuasive. But the room he entered figured that it was no longer one he controlled. Dana Mercer met him with evidence already logged. Cole stood where Silas could see plainly that county discretion was over. Mara placed land transfers, internal references, and annotated route overlaps on the table without shaking once. When Silas tried to dismiss Black Hollow as a legacy liability attached to defunct research contractors, Aaron Pike opened a folder containing photographs from that morning. Active padlocks, recent fuel drums, juvenile kennels, destroyed records, and route notes tied to ongoing movement. When Silas pivoted toward public sympathy and claimed concern for regional search and rescue innovation, Dana laid down the evaluation fragments describing failure thresholds in juvenile units. The mask did not break dramatically. Men like him rarely shattered in public. It slipped by degrees, through a tightness at the mouth, a delay in response, a flicker of calculation that arrived too late. He had counted on ambiguity. The snow, the isolation, the smallness of the town, the reluctance of people to challenge infrastructure wrapped in philanthropy. He had not counted on one half-frozen puppy making his way into the hands of a man who would not look away. By afternoon, Black Hollow had become an active state case scene. The county issued formal notices. Vane's affiliated properties were frozen pending review. Transport logs and grant records were seized. The respectable language around winter canine readiness and land management support collapsed under the weight of what the kennels, logs, and injection patterns clearly suggested. The forest that had been treated as nothing but timber and snow acquired another identity in public speech: witness. That mattered to Mara more than she expected. For years she had preserved town records because she believed memory mattered in theory. Now, she understood something deeper. When history was neglected, it became easy for power to build lies on top of it. Guarding the real story of a place was not clerical work. It was moral work. She felt that truth settle into her with such force that by the time she stepped out of town hall into the bright, cold afternoon, she already knew her life would not return to its previous scale. She would not go back to treating the library archives as merely a job. She would become their defender. Cole found his own restoration in a quieter way. Watching Vane lose the protection of polish and influence did not satisfy him as much as he would have imagined. What satisfied him was smaller and more serious. The knowledge that he had stopped cooperating with omission. He had worn the badge for years in a county where keeping the peace sometimes meant not asking the next question. But peace without truth had turned out to be cowardice in a cleaner uniform. That understanding hurt, but it also gave him back a piece of himself he had allowed to erode. When Dana Mercer thanked him for preserving the unofficial channel signal and responding before the incident could be erased, he only nodded. Yet inside, something old and honorable lifted its head again. Late in the day, Stellan returned to the cabin with Drift while the official work continued in town. The clearing looked different now, not because the trees had changed, but because Stellan had. The cabin no longer felt like a place built only for retreat. It still carried the marks of the fight. The cracked glass, the broken table edge, the bruised quiet of interrupted solitude. But it also held new fact. Drift trotted beside him across the snow, still undersized, still stiff in one shoulder, but moving with a steadier confidence than before. The nervous hypervigilance had not vanished. It would not vanish in a day, maybe not ever completely. He still checked the door first when they entered, still listened to engines with too much intensity, still woke at small shifts in the room. But now he also followed Stellan not only because safety had to be monitored, but because attachment had begun to root itself, where fear once dominated everything. Stellan stood in the doorway for a long moment after the fire was lit and the evening light had turned the clearing outside amber. He watched Drift circle once, settle near the porch threshold, and then finally relax enough to rest his chin on his paws without keeping his whole body coiled. Something about that nearly undid him. He had spent years believing that loneliness was a manageable cost, that if he kept his life small enough, nothing inside it could be taken from him again. But Drift had entered that arrangement like weather enters a valley, without permission, changing the shape of everything simply by being there. The little dog had not only survived what men had done to him, he had reached into the life of a man who thought he was finished being needed, and made that thought impossible to keep. Stellan understood then, with a calm deeper than revelation, that solitude had never truly healed him. It had only contained him. The decision that followed did not feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. Weeks later, after the state's seizures were in place and the county signed emergency custody of Black Hollow's structures over to a temporary trust, Stellan walked the grounds again, in full daylight. The steel kennels were removed, the records were boxed. The storage buildings stood open to clean air for the first time in years. Snowmelt had begun to edge the drifts, and water moved beneath the frozen creek with the first murmurs of spring. Mara came with him, and Cole, and Nolan, all of them carrying different expressions of the same astonishment, that a place built for concealment could become something else if enough honest work was done. Stellan looked across the ruined station and saw not only what had happened there, but what might replace it. A rescue shelter for abandoned working dogs. A small training and search support outpost for winter terrain calls. A place where frightened animals could be treated as lives instead of assets. Nolan immediately started asking where the map wall would go. Mara laughed for what felt like the first unburdened time in weeks. Cole said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved by the time early spring touched the valley. The hardest edges of winter had begun to soften. Snow still lay in shadowed places, but the tops of the ridges darkened with exposed earth, and the first wet scent of thaw moved through the pines. One morning, Stellan stood outside the cabin with a mug of coffee warming his hands, while sunlight spread across the clearing in thin gold bands. Drift stood beside him, not large enough yet to look like the full Malinois he should have been, but straight-backed, alert and calm. His coat shone deep fawn beneath the light. The black mask on his face looked less severe now that the eyes beneath it no longer held only warning. There was steadiness there still, and intelligence, and something gentler growing through both. Stellan looked down at him and thought of the road on the storm night, the almost erased shape in the snow, the rigid little body that had waited in silence for either mercy or the end. Sometimes he realized destiny did not arrive as a command, a mission, or some thunderous turning point worthy of being remembered in dramatic language. Sometimes it arrived as a small freezing creature standing motionless in the forest, waiting for the right man to stop. And sometimes the life you think you are saving is the one sent to lead you back toward your own. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, fire, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, trembling in the cold, waiting on a lonely road, hidden inside something the world almost passed by. In this story, Stellan thought he was rescuing a broken little dog from the snow. But in the hands of God, that small life became something far greater. Drift was not only saved from the storm, he became the way truth was uncovered. Hearts were softened, courage was restored, and a lonely man was led back to purpose. That is how God often works in our daily lives. He places small moments in front of us, simple choices, wounded people, unexpected responsibilities and what looks ordinary at first may actually be heaven's invitation to love, protect, and act with faith. Many of us are waiting for God to move in some great and obvious way, but often His mercy comes through quiet opportunities. A stranger who needs kindness, a burden we did not ask for, a life that crosses our path at exactly the right time. What we call interruption, God may call assignment. What we call accident, God may call mercy. And what feels too small to matter may become the very thing that changes us forever. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what moment in your life felt like a quiet miracle from God. And if you believe stories of courage, loyalty, faith, and redemption still matter, please subscribe to the channel so more of these stories can reach the people who need them most. May God bless every person watching, protect your family, strengthen your heart in difficult seasons, and fill your home with peace, mercy, and light.